Long ago, during the summer of 1776, two Franciscan friars seeking an overland route to the Spanish missions in California passed just north of a towering prominence of cliffs, canyons, and thick green foliage, now called Mesa Verde. It is unknown whether the fathers Dominguez and Escalante, or some later explorer or traveler, named the Mesa Verde Plateau, which means the green table. By the middle 1800s, the name was commonly used especially by miners and prospectors wandering to and from gold and silver claims in the La Plata Mountains. The true secrets of the Mesa Verde, however, were to remain hidden beneath the mounds of rubble on the mesas and within the alcoves of deeply carved canyons for another quarter of a century. Avoided for centuries by both the Navajo and Ute peoples, the crumbling ruins of the area were largely unknown to Euro-Americans until the William Henry Jackson expedition of 1874. Photographing mining activities in the region for the government, Jackson rode down Mancos Canyon on the eastern side of Mesa Verde on rumors from the gold camps that stone houses were to be seen in the cliffs. In the autumn of '74, Jackson and his party of 8 men discovered a ruin later named the Two-Story Cliff House. Climbing to the ruin, hundreds of feet above the canyon bottom, Jackson wrote of his feelings.
From this height, we had a glorious view over the surrounding canyon walls, while far below, our campfire glimmered in the deepening shadows like a faraway little red star.
Jackson was content to photograph the one ruin and soon left. 14 years later, a week before the Christmas of 1888, 2 cowboys from the Alamo Ranch in the nearby Mancos Valley were searching for stray cattle up on the Mesa Verde Plateau. Nearly blinded by blowing snow, Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason could hardly believe their eyes as they stared across the depths of Cliff Canyon. There, beneath a sandstone alcove, lay the remains of a large, silent city. Carefully climbing down the cliffs, the cowboys anxiously explored many of the hundreds of rooms. Frank McNitt, Richard Wetherill's biographer, eloquently captures what lay before the wide-eyed cowboys, dwarfed in the stillness of the ruin.
The walls rose in tumbled splendor above them for several levels, and to the height of a tall pine, reached into the shadows beyond the round tower for 200 to 300 yards. They moved, scarcely speaking, but their voices magnified in the hollow echoes across the piles of rubble. Behind them, from one room to the next, they left footprints in dust, for centuries undisturbed by any human. In the feathery dust of one room, the explorers found a stone axe, the heavy blade still lashed securely to a wooden handle. In other rooms were pottery bowls, mugs, large jars for cooking or carrying water, left as though the owners had just set them down and might return at any moment. The thought occurred, whoever they were, these people had fled after a siege, and there was evidence to support this. Roof beams had been pulled out of almost all of the rooms, and not a trace of timbers remained. And they did discover 3 skeletons lying in the rubble. But after a supposed battle, was this enough?
Virtually abandoning his ranching ventures, Richard Wetherill and later his brother John spent a portion of the next 20 years exploring the canyons and alcoves of the Four Corners area. As Richard and John were busily discovering ruins, a woman by the name of Virginia McClurg was actively lobbying for Congress to protect the ruins. Virginia, a correspondent with the New York Graphic, had been interested in the ancient cities of the Mesa Verde since her 1885 expedition, which had discovered Brownstone Face House, now known as Balcony House. Although it took McClurg and her supporters over 25 years, the bill creating Mesa Verde National Park was signed in the summer of 1906. In these early days, travel to and from the cliff dwellings took 3 long, hard days, on the back of a horse or a mule. By the 1930s, the park was easily accessed by automobile. With their arrival on Chapin Mesa, visitors were treated to tours of the cliff dwellings and nightly campfire programs. Today, Mesa Verde National Park draws 600,000 visitors a year. Administered by the National Park Service, the park covers 52,000 acres and contains nearly 3,900 archaeological sites. Contrary to popular belief, the cliff dwellings represent only a small percentage of this total. The majority of the sites are located on the mesas. It's thought that the first residents of the Mesa Verde arrived almost 2,000 years ago. Called the basket makers by archaeologists, these early farmers brought with them corn, squash, and beautifully woven baskets. Making their homes under the protective alcoves of the canyons, the basket makers supplemented their diet with deer, sheep, and smaller game. Animals were taken with snares, traps, and the atlatl, or spear thrower. Around 550 A.D., new innovations greatly improved the lives of the basket maker people. During this era, called the modified basket maker period, pottery, the bow and arrow, and the pit house made their appearance on the Mesa Verde. The pit house, a weatherproof dwelling made of poles and adobe mud, allowed many of the people to move out of the alcoves to the mesa tops. Toward the end of this period, turkeys were domesticated primarily for their feathers in the making of blankets. Beans, as a much-needed source of protein, were also introduced during this formative era. By the beginning of the developmental Pueblo period, a healthy, well-fed population expanded rapidly and scores of pit houses now dotted the mesa tops. Early in this period, around 750 A.D., the pit houses slowly disappeared as builders began to join houses together. Rooms became rectangular with vertical walls built of posts and adobe. Pueblos, a Spanish word meaning village, were joined end to end. The kiva, a subterranean room used for ceremonial purposes, also appeared during the period. A peculiarity of the developmental Pueblo period is the intentional flattening of the back of the head. The heads of infants were strapped without pillows to wooden cradle boards. By the beginning of the 12th century, hundreds of small villages were to be found on the mesas throughout the Mesa Verde region. Around 1100, the lifestyle of the Mesa Verdean people, called the Anasazi culture, climaxed in an era referred to as the Great Pueblo period. In the beginning of this period, mesa-top pueblos, now built of sandstone blocks, became larger and were often accompanied by towers. At Farview, 3 miles north of the museum, a number of Pueblo ruins from this period can be found within a 1 square mile area. For reasons we can only speculate about, the mesa-top pueblos were abandoned beginning around 1200 A.D. By the thousands, the population reoccupied the alcoves and began construction of the cliff dwellings. One theory is that the Anasazi moved to the alcoves for defense against hostile bands of nomadic hunters and gatherers. There is, however, no evidence of widespread violence at Mesa Verde. Perhaps the fear of violence drove the people into the cliffs. Another theory suggests that a shift in the climate of the area brought colder winters and less sunshine. The alcoves, many which face south-southwest, would have efficiently distributed a warming afternoon sun. Alcoves, regardless of exposure, would have provided ample protection from snows. Unfortunately, we may never know the real reason why thousands of people suddenly chose to move into the cliffs. And that mystery, perhaps one of the more intriguing aspects of the Mesa Verde saga, lies with a dozen other questions in the visitor's mind as he or she wanders with a ranger-guided tour down one of the paths into the cliff dwellings.
I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the park. Stopping here for a few minutes, I'd like to give you a little background on the people that lived here, a little information about the large cliff dwellings. Now, we call these people the Anasazi. You might wonder how we come up with a term like that. Now that's a Navajo term. And if you're familiar with the Southwest, you know the Navajo people live in the Four Corners area today. But also keep in mind that they don't come into this area until about the 1500s. They come down out of Canada, and we refer to them as the Athabascan people. Now, as they come into the Southwest here, of course they encounter many of the prehistoric ruins, and they refer to these people as the Ancient Ones. And in the Navajo language, that's Anasazi, and we use that term today to identify this culture. Now, one of the main reasons why the Anasazi people moved up into the Mesa Verde area basically was to farm the top of the mesa. Now, most of this forest directly across from us here had been cleared away. They were growing corn, beans, and squash, and at one time it's believed that they had over 2,000 acres under cultivation and reaping approximately 12 bushels of corn per acre. Now, the large cliff dwellings here are located in the caves in the bottom of the canyons. But also keep in mind that the people lived up on top of the mesa for over 600 years. And this is where most of the sites are located. They only lived in the large cliff dwellings for a little less than 75 years. Now, if you'll follow me, we'll start our tour of Spruce Tree House.
Although the people of the Mesa Verde were living in the cliffs, most of their food gathering activities still occurred in the pinyon and juniper forests on the mesas. These forests provided rich soils for agriculture and a wide variety of natural plants that were gathered, woven into articles of clothing, used as medicines, or simply eaten. The spines of the yucca, for example, were soaked in water and beaten. The resulting fibers were woven into sandals by the Anasazi. Other parts of the yucca plant were eaten while the roots could be lathered into a soap or used as a laxative. The Mesa Verde's Horn of Plenty would have contained over 100 species of edible or somehow usable plants. Access to the patches of both natural and cultivated plants on the mesas was somewhat precarious. Hand and tow trails carved into the sides of the cliffs allowed travel to and from the cliff dwellings.
And in toe holds that lead to the top of the mesa. Archaeologists have examined burials where they have found broken bones, where the bones have been laid side by side and they had healed. No doubt one of these persons have fallen from these hand and toe holds and broken a bone, but it's a good indication that the bone did heal and the person did survive the fall.
Continuing down the trail, the tour sinks deeper into the depths of Spruce Tree Canyon. Looking around, we can see the geological formations of the Mesa Verde exposed in the walls of the canyon. The Cliff House Sandstone Formation, as the uppermost layer, provided an abundant supply of talus that was shaped by the Anasazi into the masonry blocks used to build the pueblos and cliff dwellings. Underneath the sandstone lies the Menifee Shale Formation, which is responsible for the occurrence of springs and for the development of the alcoves. Precipitation, in the form of rain or snow, percolates down through the sandstone, which is very porous. Deep within the sandstone, seeping moisture hits a layer of impenetrable shale that channels the water towards the cliff where it emerges as a spring.
The large caves, or alcoves, were actually formed by moisture passing down through the sandstone. Now, much of this moisture would settle in many of the small cracks and pockets. And during the wintertime, you would have a freezing and thawing condition. As the water freezes, it expands. Expanding in small cracks, it would break rocks loose. You have small ledges and overhangs forming, and of course, after thousands of years, you would have the formation of the large caves. Of course, thousands of years later, these people would move into the caves here, build their homes here, and utilize the cave for protection. Also in the head of the canyon here, this is where the people obtained most of their domestic water. Now, if you'll follow me, we'll go on into the ruins.
The lush growth of plants and trees in Spruce Tree Canyon reflects the beneficial nature of the spring's moisture. Vegetation includes Gamble's oak, serviceberry, and tall and stately Douglas fir. When the canyon's ruin was discovered by the cowboys Wetherill and Mason, they named the dwelling Spruce Tree House because of a large tree growing in front of the site. The tree was not a spruce, it was in fact a Douglas fir. Instead of Spruce Tree House, The ruin should have been named Douglas Fir House.
Spruce Tree House is actually the third largest cliff dwelling here at Mesa Verde. Also, it's probably one of the best preserved ruins of the Southwest. About 80% of what we're looking at here this morning is the actual prehistoric structure. There's only about 20% restoration and stabilization in this ruins. Now, the cave itself goes back 89 feet. There's a little over 100 rooms here with 8 kivas, and we believe that a little over 100 people would have lived in this village. We're standing here in a courtyard, and located here are 2 subterranean chambers. These are the kivas, and basically the kiva was used as a ceremonial chamber, probably similar to what our churches are used for today. Also, this is where most of the daily activity for the family would have taken place. You do find large fire pits, and most likely there was communal type cooking. Also, there was food processing in this area. You do find grinding stones, and also small little storage bins where they might have stored some agricultural materials. Looking at the doorways and the room blocks, you would think that these were quite small people. Now, in order to come up with statistics about the people living here, we have to study burials. Now, we haven't found sufficient amount of burials for the high population. It's believed that most of the burials are located up on top of the mesa and randomly placed. Burials that we do find are usually found during the excavation of ruins. So that means they're found right down inside here. Now, some of the burials are found in the back of the cave. Also, it's not unusual to find a burial in the floor of a room block. But most of the burials are found directly across the front of the cave. Now, this is also the trash or refuge area. Now, we don't believe that there's any disrespect meant to the people that are buried in the trash area. Probably just the easiest and most convenient place to bury a person. In fact, most archaeologists believe these are people who had died during the wintertime, and it would be too much trouble to take them to the top of the mesa. But they were very formal burials. They had opened up a small opening and placed the person in the flex position. Now, this is with the arms across the chest and with the knees drawn up. Now, many times there would be burial offerings, and this could be in the form of a small cup, a bowl, or a small basket, covered over with the burial shroud, and then backfilled. Now, of course, from the burials, we can come up with the overall statistics about the people living here. Keep in mind, there was a high mortality rate in children. This brought down the overall average age to about 35, but it's believed that many of the people did live to be 50 and 60 years old. Now, the height of the people living here, the men were about 5'4", the women about 5'1". But also keep in mind that that was about the average height of the European at that time. Examining some of the room blocks here, you can see that they're about 6 by 5. As you walk through the ruins here, you'll see timbers protruding from the walls. Now, most of the timbers you'll see are the actual prehistoric timbers. Also, this is how we date the ruins through a method called tree ring dating, or dendrochronology. From examining these tree rings, we can actually tell when these trees were cut down, when construction started here, and when it ended. Also, from examining these tree rings, we can tell what the climate was like at the time the trees were growing. And of course, this is how we know about the droughts in this area in the middle of the 13th century. Also, from these tree ring dates, we know that the last construction took place here about 1278.
Using a new dating technique called archaeomagnetism, archaeologists can now date the fire pits and hearths in the village. Archaeomagnetic dating measures the remnant magnetism of clay. When a fire was lit in one of the hearths of the village, the soil surrounding the fire pit became superheated, which allowed minute particles of iron in the soil to float. Just as a magnet draws iron tacks, these iron particles were pulled toward magnetic north. Magnetic north, which erratically moves around the North Pole, has had its various positions mapped since before the birth of Christ. By extracting soil and measuring the alignment of iron particles, scientists can tell within 10 to 15 years of when a fire was lit. Moving on to the second courtyard, the tour group encounters a remarkably well-preserved room. Looking closely, one can still see the faded remnants of red decorations on a white plastered wall. In the corner of the room, black soot tells of the small fire used to heat the room during cold winters. Sections of balconies and flooring precariously hang to their anchoring walls even after 1,000 years.
In order to get timbers for their balconies and their flooring, these people had to cut down trees. Here we have some axe grooves. These people would pick up river stone, bring it up into the cave, and then they would work the stone back and forth to form stone axes that they could utilize to cut down trees with. Now that's kind of a misconception because you really can't cut a tree down with a stone axe. Basically, you have to beat it down. You walk around the tree, you beat on the tree, finally the tree gives up and falls down.
Also of interest in the second courtyard are the variety of manos and metates, otherwise known as grinding stones.
Here we have some grinding bins. There's 3 in a row. The people would bring their corn down from the top of the mesa, dry it, remove it from the cob, and then grind it into a meal. This could be added to a hot broth or baked into some type of a corn cake. Now there's only one problem with grinding your corn with stone. When you grind the corn, you grind the stone. That means you get a lot of grit in your cornmeal. 20 years of eating grit, you wear out your teeth. These people did have a lot of dental disease. This included abscesses, cavities, and some periodontal disease.
Adjacent to the corn grinding bins is a large kiva whose roof would have formed the floor of the second courtyard. The kiva, which is still used by many modern Pueblo Indians, is a ceremonial room for spiritual occasions.
Now keep in mind that there was a roof over the top of the kiva here. There was a small rectangular opening with a ladder coming down inside. Now this is how you would have gained access to the kiva. It also permitted the smoke and heat to come out of the fire pit. Now basically the kiva was used as a ceremonial chamber. And as you walk through the village here, you might notice that there are 5 inner courtyard kivas. Now maybe this village was broken down into 5 large clans or 5 large extended families, each one of the families having their own individual kiva. It's also believed that this was a matrilineal type system where all name and property was traced through the women of the clan. Now pointing out some of the features of the kiva, here we have the southern recess. It looks somewhat like an altar, and most likely it was used for that purpose. Directly behind it here is a small opening. There's a shaft that runs all the way to the floor, makes a 90-degree angle, and comes out into a large opening down below here. Now directly in front of the opening is a large piece of sandstone. This is called a deflector. In front of the deflector is the fire pit. Now what would occur here, you would have built your fire, the smoke and heat would be coming out through the small opening in the roof of the kiva. Now this would create an updraft, drawing the smoke, the heat, and the air out of the kiva, but also creating a vacuum down inside the kiva. This vacuum would draw fresh air down through the ventilation system, it would strike the deflector, and then the air would be spread more evenly throughout the room, permitting the fire to burn very brightly. It was probably very warm and comfortable down inside the kiva.
Looking down at the kiva from above, we can see 6 pillars called pilasters, which would have supported in a crib fashion the roof of the kiva and the floor of the courtyard.
This is kind of an interesting kiva. It's believed that it caught on fire at one time. You can see a charred timber lodged in the wall. Also the lower backside here is all red. Now the sandstone here has a high iron deposit in it. During the fire it oxidized and turned the lower back wall red. Another interesting feature is this large opening in the back of the kiva. This is the tunnel. It goes back and comes up in the main structure. Not all kivas have tunnels, and it's believed that it was used for some specific ceremonial purpose. Also another feature is this opening in the floor here. This is called the sipapu, or the symbolic entrance to the spirit world. Now the small openings that you'll see in the walls are called niches. It's believed that these were used for storage purposes, and they might have stored some ceremonial equipment there.
As we peer into the depths of the kiva and examine the features of the structure, we should not confuse the present appearance of the ruin with the way it appeared when found in 1888. Spruce Tree House has been excavated and stabilized. Tons of archaeological debris and wind and water-washed soils have been removed from the ruin by archaeologists. One of the earliest archaeologists to do work in Spruce Tree House was Gustav Nordenskjöld, a Swedish gentleman. Working with the Weatherills in 1891, the young Swede investigated a number of ruins on the Mesa Verde and made an extensive artifact collection.
Have you noticed that the tree that was growing up the front of Spruce Tree House is no longer here? The tree that Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason climbed down when they first discovered the ruins in 1888? Well, when Gustav Nordenskjöld was in here to investigate these ruins, he took a look at that tree one day, and he wanted to know how old it was. Well, he had a good reason. It was growing right out of the wall of this reconstructed kiva. Now, he speculated that that tree did not start growing until after the abandonment of the village. He felt if he could cut that tree down and count the rings, he could come up with an overall average date of how old the ruins were. Well, he cut the tree down, he counted the rings, and it was 176 years old. From that, he speculated that the ruins were over 200 years old. Now, he was off by a couple of hundred years. But what's kind of interesting, less than 50 years later, they developed the technique of tree ring dating that is used today. This young man must have been just a little bit ahead of his time.
Nordenskjöld also kept careful notes of his excavations and numbered each ruin in order to reference the origin of the artifacts he collected. Other early-day signatures can still be seen in the ruins by the observant visitor.
As you walked through the ruins and you have noticed Nordenskjöld's numbers, you probably have also noticed other signatures and initials that have been carved into the sandstone. Many of these would have been of the Wetherill brothers, one being maybe John Wetherill or Richard Wetherill or Clayton or their cousin Charlie Mason.
As we leave the tour, we can only marvel, as did Nordenskjöld and the Wetherills, at the air of permanence which still surrounds the ruins. Even today, we can only speculate about the reasons that compelled the Anasazi to leave their homes a mere 75 years after they were completed. Perhaps the people of the Mesa Verde found the balance between a large population and the ability of the natural resources to support that population precarious. For centuries, the forest had been cleared for the planting of crops. The telltale presence of hundreds of small dams suggests that erosion may have plagued mesas stripped of deep-rooted vegetation. A depletion of soil nutrients brought about by centuries of uninterrupted farming may have slowly decreased the annual yields of crops. The removal of the forests would have also required travel far from home in search of firewood, and as the forest thinned beneath the farmer's axe, the hunters of the villages found the herds of deer and sheep ever diminishing. In the year 1273, the rains stopped falling. Although accustomed to dry spells, the length and severity of this drought may have proved too much. One of the last datable timbers from a cliff dwelling suggests that after the year 1278, new construction came to an abrupt halt. Methodically, prized possessions were packed as families and groups slowly moved to the south, following rumors of lands rich in soils and game. By 1300, both the large and small cities in the cliffs began to crumble under the weight of abandoned neglect. Today, the ruins of the Mesa Verde Plateau memorialize a conflict between man and nature. If there are lessons to be learned from the past, the saga of the people of the Mesa Verde can only serve to reinforce the continued need for a crowded world to diligently conserve her resources. For in conflicts with nature, whether prehistoric or modern, there can be, and always will be, only one victor.